yesterday actually, and most of what I've been saying has already been said here, and I'm not so sorry about that because it shows that it could be quite relevant what we have been writing. But maybe I will try to skip some of the things that that I wanted to say, and then we could maybe move on to some questions and some discussions on the issue. So this is what I would talk about, and it is kind of we are in this you could say conflict between the industrialized agriculture and the wish for harmonization and high yields versus this interest in crop genetic resources, which will be necessary to secure food security in the long run, and for which there are actually, maybe not very detailed, but which there are international commitments to protect. And it is a serious problem. I will not go much into that. You know more about that, but there is, as we have said, there is genetic erosion, and it's exacerbated by climate change, and thereby it's a vicious circle, because genetic diversity should also be an insurance and adapt us better to the climate change. So the problem is serious, and something needs to be done about that, and somebody really needs to think hard about how we can secure crop diversity. Then what is in the one aspect of the international obligations we have been looking very much at in the Fridtjof Nansen Institute where I am, but maybe not so much from a legal perspective, and that is the concept of farmers' rights. That's somehow the international interpretation of the need of the farmer to secure crop diversity, and through mostly through because the farmer is recognized as a steward of agrobiodiversity, and therefore the farmer needs to be in a position to continue that by saving farms, by saving and using and changing and selling farm-safe seed. So that's kind of a principle that came up in the 80s and is now in the now an element in the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture, which is the basic international treaty dealing with these things. The more broad is the Convention on Biodiversity, which this treaty is actually a result of, kind of lex specialis for plant biodiversity, you could say. So it's not a very easy issue, this farmers' rights, because it's understood so differently by so many. So from a legal perspective, it may not be an ideal concept. And we don't like maybe the word farmers' rights because we are not quite sure whether there are any rights in reality. So besides that, about the expansion of, about the right of farmers to save, use and exchange and sell, there's also in the international treaty, there's also mentioned the protection of traditional knowledge as something to be promoted, and the right to equitable benefits from seeds to the farmer, and the right also for farmers to participate in decision making on these matters here. So that's really, but the farmer's right in legal sense is quite weak, because what happened when the treaty was negotiated, that strong interest, mostly from the IPR side, the UPOV. I remember that because I was there myself. I have a past in the Danish Ministry of Environment, and I was together with the Ministry of Agriculture part of the negotiations of this treaty in my former life. And I remember how those economic interest group, especially the Plant Breeders' Rights Organization, UPOV, managed to weaken down and to water out this obligation. So actually, it's very weak. According to the treaty, the parties should promote farmers' rights as appropriate and subject to national legislation. That's 3 qualifications. So it cannot really get weaker, you know, without being nothing. So that's just to say that, but it doesn't say, I don't say that it's not an important thing, and I don't say that it doesn't have a value to have it in the treaty, because what it does, well, to some extent it requires parties or countries to try to promote this farmer's right and to try to create the legal space vis-a-vis plant breeders' right, vis-a-vis seed legislation. But it doesn't really have a very, very strong legal defense against these stronger interests, you could say. That's a kind of a legal. Not many have made that legal interpretation, and it's a bit sad. But this is how a lawyer would look at that. And then coming to EU seed legislation, because that's what we see again. That's what we try to assess against the need for biodiversity. I remember in the old days there was the discussion was also between biodiversity interest and IPR interest, plant breeders' right. Nobody really talked about EU seed legislation, and I didn't know much about it myself, I have to admit. But when I got to know it better, I don't understand why it was. I think EU seed legislation is much more influential on biodiversity issues than IPR issues. It's applicable to much more than plant breeders' rights and patents, actually. So I think that's a good reason for being interested in that. Then we have been through what the EU legislation is about, so I will not say much about that, except that it is very, very complex. It's not only 2 horizontal directives and 11 vertical, it's also a number of amendments. So from a practitioner, from my point of view, it's very, very difficult to overview and understand, and from practitioners it must be terrible. So in that alone, for that reason, there are very good reasons for trying to streamline this legislation. And yeah, we have heard about that very much. We have also heard about yes, and then also about this system being more favorable to large-scale agriculture than to small-scale agriculture, for many reasons. One is also the costs, actually, for complying with this system. Then I think maybe because of the Biodiversity Convention and the international treaty was somehow influential also in the EU to bring more attention to conservation objectives. And that's why we have that derogation regime with the softening of the regulations, which we have already talked about. This has also been mentioned by many of you, so I will not even go very much into that, what it is about. 2 directives, one on crops and one on vegetables. They went some of the way, but a lot of critics, I have to say, when you see it from the side of the small-scale farmers, a lot of people have criticized it for not going far enough. There are still DUS requirements preventing many conservation varieties from being marketed. And then there is this geographically restricted thing also. But now we have learned that these regions could actually be interpreted quite wide. You know, it could be a country or even the whole Nordic. So that could maybe be overcome. But it remains for many that, coming back to this concept of farmers' rights, that it doesn't really provide at least the full space, legal space for applying that. Then what happened also, that has also been mentioned because we have somebody coming from the Kokopelli here, but the Kokopelli case is a very interesting thing, so even if it's been mentioned, I would like to say a few words more about it. Yeah, we have heard that this French association selling traditional vegetables was actually challenged by a commercial seed company, and they brought Kokopelli to court to stop it from selling its varieties, which they had done for a long time. And that French court then referred the case to the Court of Justice. And this case is so interesting because it somehow reflects the whole discourse between big-scale agriculture and small-scale agriculture. Because it started, there is an opinion by the Advocate General before the judgment, and she actually argued in favor of the small-scale farmers' interest, because she thought that from a proportionate perspective, and other EU principles also, this kind of prohibition that the big company wanted for Kokopelli, that this was against general EU law, which, if the court had followed that, it would somehow be undermining completely the whole EU seed legislation. But actually the courts normally follow the opinions of the Advocate General, but not in this case. The court then followed they somehow gave green light to the existing legislation, and they said that even if there is a proportionality issue here, and there are clearly economic consequences for traders, that somehow somebody suffers for this, they say it would not be manifestly disproportionate in relation to the aim pursued, which was economic trade interests. That's also a way to argue, but anyway, that was the case. But already now the matter of EU legislation was really high on the agenda, partly because of that case. Then coming back to the farmers' rights, which we have seen, the judgment said that this was used as an argument from Kokopelli that this was not really relevant here because the provisions were too weak. Just to come back to that they don't really have this farmers' right, don't have the legal muscles in this competition here. Actually, the Advocate General she said the same. So there's not much support in that international treaty on that issue here. So that was the case, and then at the same time there were all these reform. There was this process of reforming the EU seed legislation, also been mentioned by many. What was the rationale? I think we should have a look at that. Streamlining, good rationale, consistency, less burden, many good reasons, including also protection of biodiversity. That was actually high on the agenda for the Commission side. And the proposal, as Merete also said, it actually provided wider relaxation, derogation from DUS criteria than the existing legislation does. So there are arguments that it was actually better for biodiversity than the existing regime. But then, as we know, the Parliament rejected and the Commission withdrew the proposal. Why did they do that? It's very difficult actually to get the full picture of that. First of all, the seed industry didn't think it was really necessary to have new legislation. They were happy with the old one. But the most powerful, the highest voices came from NGOs and from organic farmers, small-scale farmers. I'm sure many of you know more about this process than me, because some of you were probably part of it. I have just read about it, so you must correct me and compliment. Well, one thing could be that actually the Commission, they painted with a very broad brush here. They actually took everything on board of plant propagation material. So these holes there was before was not there anymore. So that was maybe going too far from their side, and there were some examples of how it would work out. Then it somehow gave a lot of power to the Commission, which they didn't have before, because regulation binds its citizens, while the directives that are there, they are only binding. They have a binding effect on member states, and member states then have to implement in the country. And maybe that's what I maybe come back to also. Maybe they have implemented. That's something it would be nice to do more research in. How has member states actually implemented the directives? My hypothesis is it's very different, and it's somehow very adapted to local, national needs. And there is this kind of flexibility that nobody really talks very loud about. That would not be the case with a regulation where Commission would control everything. Too little concern for agro-biodiversity was mentioned. That is strange, I think, because you could argue this, and that you have a feeling here that this is quite new legislation. So for many, this regulation proposal was an eye-opener. They were actually not aware of what was there already. So they were kind of shocked about this prescriptiveness in the regulation, which was actually already there. But anyway, that's sometimes attention is drawn by these things. So there was not much discussion about what is actually the difference between the old legislation and this proposed one here. What's next step was is my question. I knew that more after you have talked, because nothing much is going on, I understand. There's not much action, or the Commission is sitting on their hands, as somebody said. So I think, yeah, there should be a push from member states apparently, and from NGOs and from farmers. But of course, they should know very clearly what they want. Do I have time? Yeah, I would say something about Norway, because that's where I work, even if I'm from Denmark. And they have some examples here. I'll just use that as an example. As I said, I think there is a need to do more research in how countries actually respond to all this. Norway is special because it's maybe the European country where agriculture has the least economic impact. So they have a lot of space for all kind of experiments. They are very high profile in international negotiations. They are always talking about farmers' rights, and they are paying for seminars around the world. And in that way, they are very visible. But they are also an EU member state in this respect, as a member of the European Economic Area, and thereby they are bound by EU seed legislation. Well, to say what has Norway then done in the home? To conclude already that they have somehow put themselves between two chairs. They have Ministry of Climate and Environment responsible for the Biodiversity Acts. They have very broad provisions on promoting crop genetic diversity. And then they have the Ministry of Agriculture and Food that somehow is responsible for the seed legislation. And they think that biodiversity and the international treaty obligations are beyond their mandate. So that's somehow between two chairs, which is a bit surprising when you think about Norway's high profile on that. So they have, yeah, I have said that already. When they made then, when they became member of the EEA, they made they made a national legislation mirroring completely the EU rules, very prescriptive. They misunderstood it, so they went too far. So they made it even more prescriptive than it was already, but that was very a technical exercise, not at all political, not at all, nobody was aware of what was going on, and the farmers were not aware of that. Then, as also in the EU, the whole debate about the EU seed legislation came when it was relaxed, actually. That was also in Norway. Farmers were then again allowed to save, use and exchange on a non-commercial basis, but they didn't really know that it has been prohibited before. And then this commercial basis in Norway, it has a very wide interpretation. Nobody really talks about it, but it's, yeah. There is some commercial activity going on here also. Also, there is also a kind of discrepancy between the rhetorics and actually that only 9 conservation varieties have been included in Norwegian catalogue. It has been mentioned. So some lessons from Norway. There is this, normally it's the environmental authorities that have the responsibility for biodiversity and agricultural sectors. They need to be somehow bridged, streamlined. In my home country now, it's within the same ministry, so hopefully it's going better there. And then there's this, my hypothesis about the lax enforcement, that it actually non-compliance of a lot of things to adapt to local. But from a legal point of view, we don't like that so much. We don't like that it should somehow be that things are happening in the dark. We're not talking about it. We do it in our own way, even if it's not really in complying with the rules. We should have on the table. We should have clear rules about that. We should have reformed legislation that somehow covers these things. So some of this, coming to some conclusions. Yeah, the first one is what has been already identified many times here, that it has left the seed legislation has left few opportunities for farmers to comply with what we refer to as farmers' rights. Also after the derogation regime and the strict use requirements accommodate large-scale farmers rather than the small farmers. And this, even though it has these great implications for farming, this legislation, there were little awareness about that, at least until the Kokopelli case and the EU Commission proposal. And that's coming back to that. Maybe member states, to a large extent, are not very compliant with this legislation, and maybe the Commission looks at it with a blind eye. The misperception I have also talked about, that it was not really the regulation proposal was never really compared to what was already there. That concludes my presentation. Thank you very much.